Assembly chamber. Signed. 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 Assembly chamber. Sound. 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 Assembly chamber. Sound.
Be seated. I have a number of items of business. First, before we move to today's business, excuse me, I wish to inform the Assembly that the Defective Premises Bill received royal assent on the 20th of September 2024. It will be known as the Defective Premises Act Northern Ireland 2024 and is Chapter 3. I also advise members that Lord Elliott of Ballina-Mallard has resigned as a member of the Assembly for Fermanagh and South Tyrone constituency last Friday, 27th of September. I notified the Chief Electoral Officer in accordance with Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998. I have now been informed by the Chief Electoral Officer that Diana Armstrong has been returned as a member of the Assembly for the Fermanagh and South Tyrone constituency to fill the vacancy. This morning, Ms Armstrong signed the undertaking and roll of membership and entered her designation in my presence and that of the Clerk of the Assembly, and has now taken her seat. I welcome her to the Assembly and wish her every success in her role. As a result of Lord Elliott's resignation, the office of the Chairperson of the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs became vacant. The nominating officer for the Ulster Unionist Party has informed me that Robbie Butler has been nominated for that office. Mr Butler has accepted and will take up the role from 9 a.m. on Wednesday, the 2nd of October 2024, and I am satisfied that the requirements of the standing orders have been met. Further, members, before we move on, I want to deal with some other matters. Firstly, on the 23rd of October, Mark Durkin, MLA, raised a point of order in relation to the First Minister's answer on his question to the independent review into the Department's approach to the Peacemakers Museum foil. Standing orders make clear that ministers should give answers as clearly and as fully as possible, and as I said last week, it would not be acceptable for ministers to mislead the House. Members will be aware of the long-standing parliamentary position and the previous rulings that the Speaker cannot be expected to give a definitive view on whether the answers given by the ministers are satisfactory and accurate. The Speaker has no ability to access all the materials to investigate such a matter, establish the facts and reach a definitive conclusion. However, members have the ability to pursue and probe answers with which they are unhappy, including through further questions, to establish the detail of an issue to their satisfaction. Indeed, it is their duty of this Assembly and its members to conduct thorough scrutiny of the Executive. From initial review of the official report last week, it would seem to me that the member and the First Minister were arguing on slightly different points. In his point of order, the member clearly feels very strongly that a letter from the former Permanent Secretary indicates something different. I anticipate that the member will want to pursue and probe these questions further to establish a clear account of events to his satisfaction. And I now call Mr Gaston for point of order.
Much, Mr Speaker, and just following on from that, and indeed a ruling you made on the 12th of March earlier this year regarding the Minister's responsibilities, I would ask you in your office to have a look at question and the answer to 14683, where the Minister for Communities has partially answered the question and has left out the detail that I would request. On that basis, I would like you to follow on what you've been doing and make a ruling to ensure that the Minister has been providing a full and frank answer to all the questions that have been asked.
I thank the member for the point of order and giving me advance notice. I have already highlighted that standing orders require answers to be full and clear, and while it's in order for a minister to report the information an arm's-length body has provided to them, I fully appreciate that the member has an issue with the detail of the question not being answered. I understand he has tabled a further question, and I'd encourage him in that approach to obtain the information that he has asked for and for the arm's-length body to ensure that they provide it to the Minister. Next item of business then is member statements, and I call Colin Gildernew.
Can call you, and I raised this morning members to raise the issue around property management companies and shared area maintenance contracts in residential estates right across the north. This has been raised recently with me both as a constituency MLA. It has been raised from outside my constituency in relation to a committee role, and it has been raised as of last week with the committee. And it would appear that there are a huge amount of issues arising from these contracts and a dearth of regulation around the contracts themselves. Issues that have been raised with me are performance of the contracts themselves in terms of the work that is being or not being done, accountability and contact with the companies in order to raise issues or complaints, fees and charges which are levelled against the work which do not seem to be in line with the work being done, and indeed it would appear at times aggressive pursuit of late payments or non-payment charges where disputes arise. So in relation to this, I in my own constituency, there's one estate in particular, Beachville Heights. I have not been able to secure a meeting with the management company, so I do have a very keen understanding of the difficulty residents must be facing in this regard. I just want to flag it today, the committee, and certainly I will be taking forward additional work around this, but I think it's an area as an Assembly we will need to look at where improvements can be made.
Robert Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the ongoing inquiry in Muckamore Abbey Hospital that many of us are aware of. I was shocked last week to read where a former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at Muckamore Abbey Hospital was absolutely horrified by allegations of abuse of patients the inquiry heard. Dr. Colin Milligan described his shock, anger and despair at revelations, but he said he had never been aware of poor treatment of some patients. Mr. Speaker, if my memory serves me correctly, in my representation of a constituent who is a resident of that establishment and was under that same doctor's care, this patient, and I can only describe him without the parents' permission, is about 6'4". Regularly, with clothes being brought in, new clothes being brought from the family, and regularly when the family came to visit him, he was wearing clothes that would have probably suited someone about 5 foot tall. Quite often, the family would have been in contact to try and speak to their loved one in the hospital, and quite often they were told he was sleeping. On a number of occasions, we questioned the medication of this young fella, and with a lot of work, we contacted the hospital via the mother, the next of kin, and we were denied any information under Dr. Milligan's care of this patient. We were told the young lad had capacity. Then we went with the young lad, met the young lad, we got a signature, we made a further submission, and again we were denied. That's to say, they were very obstructive, but eventually we got that information, Mr. Speaker. And we got that information that proved that this young fellow was on medication that was keeping him in a state which he was, the parents had witnessed, and which was unnecessary and could only be described as a form of abuse. So to say that I was shocked last week when I read the newspaper article of Dr. Milligan's recollection would be an understatement. Dr. Milligan should have been very aware, because many of the patients under his care were abused. To keep persons dressed and clothes inappropriate, in my book, is a form of abuse. To prescribe medication to keep them in a comatized state rather than working with them is a form of abuse. And all of those things happened, if my memory corrects me, or stands corrected, my memory serves me correctly rather, Dr. Milligan was the said doctor. So I can only hope, as this inquiry concludes, that others will give evidence to disprove the evidence given by Dr. Milligan and other senior clinicians, and whatever has went on in that hospital, we come to a good conclusion, and that the just outcome for those patients who are mistreated, that they get satisfaction and the families get satisfaction.
Connie Egan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to bring attention to a monumental scandal brought into sharp focus for the public on Nolan Live. The fraudulent activity that appears to be conducted through the Just Eat delivery app has lost businesses across Northern Ireland, including in my own constituency of Northdown, hundreds of thousands of pounds. Numerous food partners that have joined the Just Eat server have appeared to have fallen victim to a cybersecurity breach. This has led to the bank details of enterprises being altered to those of an unknown third party, resulting in the theft of income that should have been made through working with Just Eat. This has left a large hole in the pockets of businesses to pay rent, trying to pay staff and cover the costs of running. In my own constituency, I'd like to call particular attention to the Bacara, who have lost £19,000, and Lely's, who've lost £7,500. While Just Eat make a percentage and commission off each order, I would ask, have they profited while this theft has occurred? I spent time with the owner of the Bacara on Thursday night and heard from him the absolute impact and lack of trust this has left between business owners and the delivery technology providers. They are just absolutely devastated. These businesses deserve their funds back, and instead of acting with compassion and taking responsibility, Just Eat originally stated that upon investigation there had been no breach of security. Instead, the press statement insinuated fault upon the businesses who have been victims and mentioned that they had shared their access codes, many of them who have said they absolutely did not. Northern Ireland Food to Go Association have been working tirelessly representing businesses across Northern Ireland who have fallen victim to this issue. But this whole circumstance, however, opens up multiple questions of how this has been allowed to happen. The regulation of these online delivery and service providers and their cybersecurity. In my opinion, Just Eat can more than afford to reimburse the food establishments affected, and I call on them to do so immediately. I would also urge the Minister for the Economy to look into these issues and give clarity to all those impacted so that they know that we as an Assembly stand with them.
Dr. Aiken.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put on record some remarks about the events in Lebanon last week. Hassan Nasrallah and the terrorist group he led, Hezbollah, were responsible for killing hundreds of Americans over a 4-decade reign of terror. His death from an Israeli airstrike is a measure of justice for his many victims, including thousands of Americans, Israelis and Lebanese civilians. The strike that killed Nasrallah took place in the broader context of the conflict that began with Hamas's massacre on October the 7th, 2023. Nasrallah the next day made the fateful decision to join hands with Hamas and open what he called a northern front against Israel. The United States fully supports Israel's right to defend itself against Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and any other Iranian-supported terrorist groups. And Hassan Nasrallah was a terrorist with American blood on his hands. Across decades, his leadership of Hezbollah destabilised the Middle East and led to the killing of countless innocent people in Lebanon, Israel, Syria, and around the world. Today, Hezbollah's victims have a measure of justice. Mr. Speaker, these are not my words, but I think most right-minded people who understand the malign hand of Iran in the horrors of the Middle East will agree with them. For those who do not recognise the quotes, these are the words of President Joe Biden and, secondly, Vice President Kamala Harris. We should all welcome their unambiguous clarity, and rather than writing letters of support to Iran's leadership, like some political leaders in this island have done, we should be reflecting on the clear lead shown by the United States on the reality of the situation in the Middle East. And rather than seeking to appease the perpetrators, we actually take a firm stance against terrorism, no matter where it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Pat Sheehan.
Corla, I want to make a statement today in relation to the decision by the Education Minister, Paul Givan, to meet the LCC. This is made up of a number of loyalist gangs, narco gangs, and so forth. And the Minister's decision was wrong on a number of levels. First of all, given the state of chaos in regard to provision of special educational needs at the minute, we heard the independent autism reviewer on BBC last week saying that she has been asking for a meeting for quite a while now, and the Minister can't find space in his diary to meet her. One would think that advocates within the community and voluntary sector, and even this particular woman who was appointed by the Department of Health and who is the independent autism reviewer, that the Minister would at least make space in his diary to meet her. And I also know that Conran Gaeilge has been asking the Minister for a meeting since last February. And again, the Minister couldn't find space in his diary to meet this organisation, the main advocates for Irish medium and the Irish language in the north here, in fact in the whole country. So I wonder, what priorities the Minister has and why he can't meet advocates from within different sectors in the education area, but he can meet these loyalist gangs who, after 26 years, still haven't packed up and gone away. And I'm all for meeting and speaking to people and trying to get them to move away from what they're doing. But no education minister should be taking direction from these particular gangs. And the LCC said they wanted to meet on a number of issues, educational underachievement, and they were also demanding that Scull and Sholta, the Irish medium school in East Belfast, shouldn't be given any support from the Education Department. And that is absolutely outrageous, that these gangs would be demanding of a minister not to support a school for children whose parents want them to be educated through the medium of Irish. It's absolutely outrageous. And the minister should make clear that under no circumstances is he going to give in to that outrageous demand.
I rise today to speak on behalf of a family facing an incredibly challenging and heartbreaking situation. On September the 10th, Leslie Putz, a beloved mother and grandmother from Northern Ireland, flew from Dublin to Dubai to support her daughter who was going through a very difficult pregnancy. Sadly, just a few days into her stay, the whole family, including Leslie, contacted a severe sickness bug. After initially showing some symptoms on the 15th, Leslie's condition deteriorated rapidly and she was rushed to the hospital on September 20th, diagnosed with sepsis, blood poisoning and multiple organ failure. She was minutes away from losing her life. Thanks to the swift actions of paramedics and the outstanding care in the A&E team in the Parkview Medical Clinic in Dubai, Leslie was stabilised and admitted into the ICU. She remains in critical condition on a ventilator, ongoing dialysis and fighting liver and kidney failure. In addition to the emotional toll, the financial burden on this family is absolutely immense. Leslie unfortunately had no private health insurance and the costs to her treatment alone are mountedly rapidly up, exceeding over £15,000 within the first 24 hours alone. The family is now facing what could be hundreds of thousands of pounds in medical bills, if not up to £1 million for a transplant. If Leslie recovers, they will also need her to fly home to the UK. It is with a heavy heart, yet strong hope, that the family has turned to the community for support. They are determined to give Leslie every chance to survive this horrible ordeal. Any contribution will not only ease the financial burden and strain, but allow her loved ones to focus on what truly matters, being there for their mum. I urge everyone to keep Leslie and her family in their thoughts and prayers during this incredibly difficult time. A GoFundMe has been set up online and I would urge members to share this if they can and of course donate. The family would be deeply grateful for any assistance as they do everything in their power to save their mum, as she's far too young to go and they need her with her. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I want this morning to reflect on the important question of accountability and responsibility taking in this place. It's a theme that I've reflected on many occasions since taking up our role in opposition, and it keeps getting more and more important, and there keep being more and more examples of executive ministers and executive parties seeking to shift blame, shift responsibility and not take accountability either for decisions they have or for decisions they could take. Why this matters is that all of us stand for election to this place and we take the pledge of office, and I welcome the new member who's taken the pledge of office today, Ms Armstrong. We all sign the pledge of office and join this assembly as an act of taking responsibility to the constituents we serve and Northern Ireland at large. Over the last few weeks we've seen examples of comic and grave responsibility shifting. We heard last week from the Infrastructure Minister about how he couldn't install a few bollards in Hill Street, which is one of the most important thoroughfares in our hospitality district in the middle of Belfast, because of austerity. Now, austerity is a grave and profound challenge for this place, for the executive and for all of these islands. But austerity isn't to blame for not being able to install a few bollards in the Cathedral Quarter, Mr. Speaker. It is pathetic and it's drivel to simply shift blame in that way. We've also seen executive party after executive party put down motions talking about delivery when their ministers are the ones responsible for the specific areas of delivery. Sinn Féin colleagues put down a motion on ticket touting on secondary sales after the scandal over Oasis tickets. They didn't call on their minister, the Minister of Economy, to take any action. It's ridiculous. We saw the Alliance Party put down a motion on green growth in which they congratulated and garlanded their minister, the Environment and Agriculture Minister, for action he had taken, but not calling on the Environment Minister to do anything to deliver the Green New Deal that's in their manifesto. All of this stuff is, I'm afraid, what gets at the heart of responsibility shifting in this place, this sense that all of us are in here, we all want a little bit of power, but no one wants to take responsibility or accountability. It's pathetic. We need to do better. And we need to prove to the people who elect us here that we are properly about our work in terms of taking responsibility and delivering for people who send us here. And Mr. Speaker, just finally, given the day said, I think it is important to reflect on another area of accountability that we do need to see some clarity on. In the last couple of days, we've seen news over very grave reports around a former member of staff in this Assembly who was given references by employees of a party in this Assembly who then went on to seek employment in another organisation. When it comes to accountability and responsibility, there are further questions to be answered about that. I and others will be asking those questions, and I hope that we get clear answers. Thank you.
Peter McReynolds.
Mr. Speaker, and I became a member of the Policing Board a few months ago, and since then have had the opportunity to hear from the police about their views on next steps on a variety of different issues. I've had the opportunity to scrutinise officers and directly hold them to account, all essential functions of a Policing Board member. But on Friday night, I arrived at 11 p.m. at Lisburn Road Police Station and had the opportunity to spend time with two local policing officers, Peter and Nigel, who impressed me with their diligence, empathy, desire to help regardless of the situation, and moreover, their ability to adapt in real time to new circumstances. On getting there, I heard about the ongoing policing response to a fatal car accident in East Belfast. We then left the station to assist with a potential missing persons search. We were then directed to a protesting domestic violence incident and helped a deeply distressed woman covered in blood get back to her family safely in Lisburn. And then I watched them adapt in real time and establish a car that was badly parked, was worth closer inspection. It had no insurance, they shouldn't have been driving for a variety of different reasons, and they were intoxicated with two passengers who were children in the back seat. Throughout all this, they answered my questions from the back seat about the challenges towards delivering policing in Northern Ireland, so it was a very eventful evening. I was able to head home bleary-eyed for 4:30 in the morning, and they returned to their station to begin the paperwork from the events that had just passed before clocking off at around 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. Mr. Speaker, I know many MLAs here today will have had the opportunity to observe the police in action, but it truly was one of the most rewarding, eye-opening and impactful evenings of my time in politics. My main takeaway was that they're playing a crucial role across all our communities, and yes, the resources are challenging, but it was a reminder to me that when this place is functioning, we can do an awful lot more than when it isn't. So like the police supporting our communities and the group of Neighbourhood Watch coordinators I met the next day, let's push on as an executive and an assembly to support our police and all our departments with consistency, diligence and an ability to adapt ourselves to deliver the safe, thriving and united community that Northern Ireland deserves. Thank you.
Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some may be aware, some may not be aware, but today is National Non-Speaking Verbal Awareness Day, and I would like to make the House aware of a vision called Love Needs No Words NI Hub. Their mission is clear: to create meaningful connections and provide vital services for individuals who are non-speaking and non-verbal, regardless of their disability, diagnosis or their age. I would ask everyone to imagine a world where every voice is heard, even the ones that may not speak. Imagine the breakthroughs, the understanding, the joy we could cultivate by simply giving people the tools and the space to communicate in their own unique way. This is what should drive us, the belief that communication is more than just words, and that every individual deserves to have their own ways of expressing themselves. Advocates and parents of non-verbal children have unwavering optimism for what can be and what should be, because they know that together we can build something special, something that truly matters. But their approach is guided by kindness, care and a deep sense of responsibility to foster inclusivity in all of our communities. But they're not just creating a hub of support. They're changing the way the world understands non-verbal communication. So today, on National Non-Speaking Non-Verbal Awareness Day, I invite you to join us in celebrating this important day, because together we can bring awareness to a world that often overlooks the beauty of non-verbal expression, where we can build a community that is compassionate and open to the diverse ways in which people communicate. However, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about raising awareness. More importantly, it is about changing lives. It's about creating a place where everyone, no matter their ability or means of communication, feels valued and understood and heard. I mean, it can only do that collectively. So therefore, it's our commitment as legislators to put our shoulder to the wheel. And with our support, we can build a truly transformative space that has the power to spark real change right across all of our communities. So I'm asking you today, take a moment to visit the Love Needs No Words NI Hub website, learn about their vision, and think about the difference we can make together. It only takes one connection, one act of kindness to set off a ripple that could help so many wonderful individuals on their journey to finding their voice. So let's join forces, lift each other up, and create a community where everyone belongs. I believe in this dream, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that others can see it too. Thank you.
Jonathan Buckley.
Hypocrisy is never far from this place, and it would seem that we had a fresh dose today from Mr. Sheehan. He wanted to question the priorities of an education minister who, since taking office, has hit the ground running on tackling the priorities affecting everyday citizens in Northern Ireland. Meeting over 70 schools since taking office, this minister has set about an approach to tackle the huge childcare bills facing everyday constituents, to settling teacher pay issues, creating an additional 1,400 places for children with special needs, and yes, tackling educational underachievement, an issue that this House should be ashamed of its track record. Sadly, working-class Protestant boys have faced the worst brunt of educational underachievement in this country. Well, I've got news for this House, Mr. Speaker. The DUP will not leave behind its working-class loyalist communities, regardless of where they come from. They deserve the right to educational attainment like every other citizen in this place. Many parties have questioned the rule of law. I dare remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that it was the DUP in 1998 that opposed the release of prisoners onto our streets, which is why today's comments from Mr. Sheehan is particularly alarming, because this looked at his own history. In 1978, Pat was sentenced to 15 years in jail for trying to bomb a cash and carry. Mr. Sheehan was released from prison in 1987. In 1989, he was sentenced to 24 years for leaving a bomb at a Belfast security checkpoint, released under the terms of the Belfast Agreement. But members, even that didn't spur the blushes of the bold Mr. Sheehan. He wasn't quite done at that stage from insulting victims, and around 2010, he described the Northern Ireland conflict as probably quite civilised. In one chilling intervention, Mr. Speaker, he said that the IRA could have left a 1,000-pound car bomb on the Schenkel Road if it had wanted to kill Protestants. And for those who perhaps felt that he has moved on with time, around 2006, he said, "I am proud that I took up arms." What hypocrisy have we heard from the member today? And what about Sinn Féin? In 2021, the PSNI assessment of the IRA Army Council relationship with Sinn Féin maintained that it remains unchanged. Perhaps the party should take the plank from its own eye before it casts aspersions upon members who are committed to the rule of law and committed to delivering for every community across Northern Ireland.
I call Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish I rise today to congratulate New Irish Arts as they celebrated their 30th anniversary this weekend with two very special performances in the Waterfront Hall. For over 3 decades, the New Irish Arts Group have been equipping and giving opportunities to musicians, churches and organisations right across the country and beyond. The New Irish Arts was set up in 1994 by renowned local hymn writer and musician Keith Getty, someone who has went on to achieve incredible success around the world and is a great ambassador for Northern Ireland. It was 1 year later that Jonathan Ray, BEM, got involved in New Irish Arts, and through his leadership has been instrumental in seeing the group grow from strength to strength as he has been creative director since 2005. Jonathan actually taught me how to play or not to play the recorder many years ago in Bangor Grammar School, with limited success, unfortunately. But the New Irish group is made up of several hundred dedicated volunteers of all ages, making up the choir, orchestra, as well as having a very vibrant and talented youth choir and youth orchestra. and a committed audiovisuals team. It also provides wonderful opportunities for young people to develop and perform using their musical talent and skills. The group are always in great demand right across Northern Ireland and beyond, and perform at many concerts, broadcasts and events throughout the year, including annual charity collections at their creative events. New Irish has had a very positive impact on church worship right across these islands, and now for over 30 years. And I want to warmly congratulate everyone involved in the New Irish Arts Group, which is based in Bangor, as they celebrate these 30 years and look back proudly on their past, and wish them very well for the next 30 years as well, and pay tribute to Jonathan and all the dedicated volunteers involved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Timothy Gaston.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute for the life of Robin Kyle, who was suddenly called home last Wednesday when sitting peacefully in front of his fire in his living room. Robin was well known within the farming community and within the Presbyterian Church where he served as an elder. However, it was through the loyal orders that Robin gained his respect from right across Northern Ireland. Serving 39 years as a County Grand Master in Tyrone Royal Arch Purple Chapter, 29 years as Secretary to his own Orange Lodge, and a Grand Lecturer and Grand Master in the Royal Arch Purple. Whether it's through the loyal orders or during his over half a century with the Department of Agriculture, Robin's life was one of service to others. Yes, Robin will be sadly missed in all these circles, but he will be missed most in the family home. Robin was a husband, a father and a granda. I think today of his wife Agnes, his son Alistair and daughter Pamela, and his two grandchildren Eva and Isaac. The wisest man who ever lived reminds us in Proverbs 27:1, "Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth." Thankfully, Robin was a saved man and was ready when the call came.
2 minutes, and I call Deborah Erskine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, there are many homes across Northern Ireland that are grieving today due to the tragic and sad loss of a loved one on our roads. The shock of that never leaves you. An empty seat at a table, missed family events, those cannot be replaced. In my own constituency of Fermanagh and South Tyrone, there have been 3 fatalities in the space of approximately 10 days. Communities and families have been plunged into heartbreak and grief. And I publicly want to send my condolences to those families today and all those across Northern Ireland who are in that position. Recently, the Executive launched their road safety document. It is important that we take that seriously and implement it. Unfortunately, the level of fatalities on our roads brings this into sharp focus. I cannot say strongly enough from this chamber, as road users, we all have a duty to make sure that there is safety on the roads. Our choices on the roads can be the difference of you or someone else getting home safely to your family. Improving roads to ensure they are safer can only go so far. It is down to each of our own decision making. I travel quite a bit on the roads, on the West Link, on the M1 and across roads in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, and it is astonishing to see people put on their makeup while they're driving, eat their breakfast, use their mobile phone, and as somebody recently told me, they've seen somebody reading a book while driving. As an MLA, each week I have a number of queries from constituents highlighting the speed of drivers on our roads. It is disgraceful that people disregard the regulations of our road. A split second can change everything in an instant. And we must make sure no families have to suffer the pain and loss of a death due to a road traffic collision. We must need to ensure that we send a strong message to share the road to zero. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before we move to the next item of business, I have one other issue that I wanted to bring before the House, and it is to remind members of Standing Order 1(2). That the Chair's ruling on all questions of procedure is final. When the Deputy Speakers or I are speaking, members should resume their seats, and if the Chair gives a direction that a member's time is up, or they need to return to the subject of debate, then they should follow the direction without challenge. I recognise that we have a number of relatively new members, but this is an area that we'll be keeping an eye on, and if necessary, a member will be asked to resume their seat and may not be called again for some time if there's a lack of cooperation. Before we move to the next item of business, we're going to change chair, so members take their ease.
The next item of business is a motion from the opposition on mental health provision in Northern Ireland. Clerk, please read the motion.
That this Assembly regrets the state of mental health service provision in Northern Ireland, laments that the number of people who have passed away as a result of suicide is higher than those who lost their lives in the Troubles, and calls on the Minister of Health to work with his executive colleagues to commit in the draft programme for government to make the prevention of suicide a priority across all departments and to utilise every resource to support those struggling with suicidal thoughts, to introduce targets to address the prevalence of mental health disorders across all age groups, and to introduce targets to tackle the rate of anxiety and depression in children and young adults.
Thank you, and I call Colin McGrath to move the motion on behalf of the opposition.
So moved, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Colin. So the Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 1 hour and 30 minutes for this debate. The proposer of the motion will have 10 minutes to propose and 10 minutes to wind. As an amendment has been selected and is published on the Marshall list, the Business Committee has agreed that 15 minutes will be added to the total time for the debate. Colin, please open the debate on the motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Principal Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to open this opposition day and to present this motion on mental health. At the beginning, I wish to pay tribute to the many organisations, groups and professionals that the opposition has engaged with ahead of today, and I'm delighted that a number of them are here today with the Mental Health Action Policy Group in the Long Gallery. Many of these groups and organisations truly are at the coalface of the continuing mental health crisis across Northern Ireland. And I do not say that lightly, because truly we are in the midst of a crisis. The most recent data tells us that in the year 2022, over 200 people lost their lives to suicide. And since 1998, more people have lost their lives to suicide than lost their lives in the Troubles. 200 lives lost. Countless family members left to pick up the pieces of a life that was cut short. Innumerable friends, colleagues, or even strangers left wondering why, and could I have helped them in any way? And as an Assembly, we too must ask why, and we also must ask if there's something that we can do to help. That is the first step of the journey that we embark upon today through our debates. I have mentioned the many groups and organisations working in the crisis who are here today as well. Yet many of those organisations struggle year on year to put a proper budget in place, and most recently, some have seen their core grant slashed by 50%. Addressing that has to be the second step of our journey. And the third step will be to examine how other departments have a role to play and proposes one solid outcome which the Executive could take forward to help the most vulnerable in our society. So that is the journey that we embark upon today through our Opposition Day motions, and I encourage every member that this is not about blame, this is not about point scoring or pontificating. With each contribution that you make, please keep those that are struggling with their mental health, keep those families who have lost someone to suicide to the forefront of your mind. Today is an opportunity to improve people's lives.
Let our responsibility as legislators and our empathy as fellow human beings be the twin lens by which we approach today's debate. I have mentioned that over 200 people lost their lives to suicide in the year 2022. Even one life is too many. As part of our response to the crisis, the previous Health Minister and the Executive launched a 10-year mental health strategy. The scope of that strategy and the associated action plan and the funding commitment were unprecedented and, like today, offer a unique opportunity to improve people's lives. Within that strategy sat 35 high-level actions for the development and transformation of services, with 5 standout actions identified. They are an action plan for early intervention and prevention, increasing the funding for CAMHS, changing the structure of service delivery, integrating the community and voluntary sector in that delivery, and developing a regional mental health service across our 5 health trusts. To date, approximately 20 of those key actions have started, and that is positive and it has to be welcomed. But on the flip side, none of the actions have been completed, and however, the strategy has been failed and constrained by recurrent underinvestment. In the last year alone, over 24 million should have been allocated to the strategy's implementation, but instead it has received just over 25% of its necessary funding. If we do not properly fund the strategy, then it will fail. So clearly we need to see it funded properly if we want it to succeed. And I want to be unequivocal in my remarks today. I do not doubt for 1 second the Health Minister's commitment to the strategy or his desire to see it succeed, and I say that of his predecessor Robin Swan as well, because it was the previous Health Minister who told us at Health Committee that he had sought a commitment that as part of any monitoring rounds that health would be the priority for the Executive. However, the Ministers for Economy and Education made the same ask, and so no commitment could be given. Now, I appreciate that funding comes from the Treasury, and the inclination for some is to point the finger to the UK Government while saying, please sir, I want some more. However, the question of how much money the Treasury provide us is irrelevant if our Executive are not on the one page, speaking with one voice in a spirit of commonality and shared purpose with clear and measurable targets. That is what we are seeking today. I would ask to take a quick moment to address as well today's amendment. I always welcome the opportunity for amendments, and often they can complement and actually enhance motions and indeed legislation. However, the amendment that is presented today is essentially a rewrite of the original motion with just one strange omission. The amendment laments the number of people who have died as a result of suicide. So does our motion. It calls for the Minister to work with his colleagues to prioritise suicide prevention. So does our motion. It calls for support for those experiencing suicidal thoughts. So does ours. And calls for targets to support children and young people. The original motion does all those things. But the fundamental difference in the amendment is it removes the request to include all these things within the programme for government. The draft programme for government already skirts over the issue of mental health. This amendment removes it entirely from the conversation. I will not support that, and the SDLP cannot support that. If we were to support that, then we would send a startling message from this House to all those that are struggling with mental health and to all those organisations that are currently upstairs in the long gallery, whose members will undoubtedly be photographed alongside today. The message forever will be printed above this building that our programme for government does not prioritise mental health because we're just not going to talk about it. We owe it to the many thousands of people who have lost their lives to suicide. We owe it to the countless people who are seeking help with their mental health and the many organisations trying to fill the void which we as an Executive and Assembly are not servicing, to give them the assurance that for this Executive mental health will be a priority. Let mental health be a priority when the Executive weigh up the question of cutting budgets or revenue raising. Let mental health be a priority with the Executive whenever they're considering working in silos as opposed to working together. Let mental health be a priority in the delivery of the programme for government. I look forward to the debate today. I look forward to hearing from the Executive Party's representative and the Minister at how we're going to respond to this crisis. And as I said at the outset, let's keep those most vulnerable to the forefront of our minds and our decisions today, and let's deliver something positive for them. Let this place offer some hope and not another reason for despair. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Diane Dawes to move the amendment. Thank you, Diane. You will have 10 minutes to propose and 5 minutes to wind, and all other speakers will have 5 minutes. Diane, could you move the debate on the amendment, please?
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. I rise to propose the amendment today, not as the previous speaker, and I regret some of his remarks, to indicate that we don't want to talk about mental health, but to slightly broaden the scope of the original motion, to talk about general levels of mental health well-being as well. So it is in that spirit that I offer the amendment, not in a spirit of shutting down conversation about what I think is the most important issue that we could address, and one which I know the Minister has made a priority. And we are glad, Minister, to see you back in your chair today, and we hope that you're feeling reasonably well after COVID. It can be very debilitating. So we also felt that it was important to emphasise not simply what Stormont departments could do, but what other agencies, as well as our crucial community and voluntary sector, could contribute as well. Appropriate oversight of mental health services has been recommended in a number of important reports in recent years, and my colleagues and I are contacted regularly about the lack of access for services for ADHD and autistic spectrum disorders, as well as mainstream general, adult and children's mental health services. I have to say that there was actually little ambition in the recently published Mental Health Strategy Delivery Plan for 24-25. The 50-page document contained less than 8 pages on what is planned to happen this year. And what is achieved so far, Minister, is welcome, but it is a drop in the ocean compared to what the strategy envisages. A firm grip needs to be taken on the mental health strategy, with concerted efforts on its dozens of actions, otherwise it will become quickly outdated. The mental health champion Siobhan O'Neill earlier this year expressed significant concerns about the lack of investment in the mental health strategy, calling it incredibly disappointing that the Department of Health had invested only £9 million in the strategy. Around 7% of our local health budget is allocated to mental health, well behind England, 11.4%, Scotland, 9.4%, and Wales, 13.3%. And while some will criticise the broader executive, it's not something that can solely be blamed on, because it is also about prioritisation within the Department of Health itself. The idea that the executive could simply hand over £1 billion of additional money for a strategy on top of what health already receives, I don't think was ever going to be a realistic prospect in challenging financial circumstances. The Public Accounts Committee made a number of recommendations to the Department of Health last year on mental health, and only a few have been acted upon. Some of these recommendations included more funding for mental health as an invest to save opportunity, to set out a target timeframe over which to grow funding towards the 10% figure suggested by the mental health champion, to grow the mental health workforce, And while there is a general need to reduce the numbers on waiting list, there's a particular need to address the numbers waiting for psychological therapies, and that the department urgently implements services for those with co-occurring mental health and substance use issues, stating it was not acceptable that the pace of change in this area was simply too slow. In the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey of 2023, only 50% of those aged 18 to 24 reported positively about their mental health and well-being. And I think that is such a sad statistic about Northern Ireland. Research has shown that half of adult mental health disorders develop before the age of 18, highlighting the need to prioritise the acquisition of resilience and coping skills from a very early age. The Youth Wellbeing Survey in Northern Ireland 2020 found anxiety and depression levels to be around 25% higher than the child and youth populations in other regions. This reflects a similar trend in the adult population in Northern Ireland. Also, the Life and Times survey, 29% reported that their mental health and well-being had been impacted by Northern Ireland's troubles. Last week I had the opportunity to meet with New Script for Mental Health, who have been highlighting that 1 in 5 adults in Northern Ireland was prescribed an antidepressant last year. 1 in 5 adults. That is a shocking number. In the poorest areas, and this ties into the Minister's focus on health inequalities, that was 27% of the population, and it represents a 4-fold increase in the last 20 years. 40% of females aged 45 to 64 were prescribed an antidepressant in the past year. 40% of females 45 to 64 were prescribed an antidepressant in the last year. There does not appear to be a plan from the department to address this rise in prescribing rates. And Minister, in your response, that is one of the issues that I would like to hear about, because I think those are fairly shocking statistics for Northern Ireland. In 2021, the Office for Statistics Regulation criticised mental health data, stating it did not serve the public good. And last year, the Northern Ireland Audit Office said, as a result, it was not able to conclude whether whether mental health services were actually providing value for money. So the actual data needs to be improved as well, so that we can better serve people who are experiencing mental health issues. But mental health has a devastating impact on the individual, but it is also having an impact on the workforce and on growing the economy. And the rise in work-limiting conditions across the United Kingdom in recent years has been driven by sharp increases in reported mental health, particularly amongst younger workers. The number of workers aged 16 to 34 who report their mental health limits the type or amount of work they do has increased by 4-fold over the last decade. Mental health is now the most common cause of work-limiting conditions among those aged 44 and younger in the United Kingdom. I think, and I've spent some time looking at the statistics and quoting them and putting them on record in the House, because I think that they are quite shocking. And the more I hear and look at them, the more I'm convinced of that. And that does mean that we have to tackle the awful number of suicides, but also the general mental health and well-being issues that are experienced by our population. And I offer the amendment in that spirit, not in a spirit of hiding any of these issues, because they're issues that I have spoken about and speak to individuals and groups about on a regular basis. And I would urge the Assembly to consider the motion. Thank you. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Diane, and I call her Leah Flynn.
Alas Cancolia, and I thank the members who brought this motion to the floor of the Assembly today. I know that Colin had mentioned some of the statistics, as did Diane, around the deaths by suicide. And I know when you're talking about these issues, even using numbers and figures, as Colin had said, you know, you're talking about people's lives and families that have been impacted. But just to say, yes, we are in the remit of over 200 deaths by suicide. The provisional figures seem to be showing actually a slight increase in the 2023 figures, maybe 221. But I also want to touch on, you can't have a conversation around mental health, suicide prevention, and not mention the 585 lives that have been lost as a result of drug deaths over the past 3 years. Actually, the biggest killer is in terms of alcohol. You're talking 350 deaths, around that figure, every single year. So all of these deaths, I think this is a sad thing in this debate, that all of these deaths are preventable somewhere along the line. And the fact that our drug deaths and our alcohol deaths have actually doubled over the past 10 years, then it is timely that we're having this debate today to try and refocus minds in terms of how we can make some of this better. I do also want to say that over the past number of years, Sinn Féin have gathered with families that have been bereaved through suicide and through drug deaths, just out the front of Stormont there around Christmas time when the Christmas trees went up. And the families, what they've been calling for is actually the same thing that the motion's calling for. So more action, more cross-departmental working and investment in how we can try and tackle addiction and mental health. I know the Alliance Party joined with us last year out the front of Stormont, and I do hope that if the families gather again this year, and they're from right across the north, I hope that every party can come out and talk to them, because these are the people that have already lost their loved ones, and these are the people that we need to be taking our guidance in terms of what we can do better and how we can do it better. So I also want to thank the Minister, who personally met with a number of the families just a number of weeks ago, and I do look forward to visiting the People's Kitchen charity alongside him as well, again where you're actually meeting directly with the people that these issues impact on, and with the work that the People's Kitchen are doing. I know that's some of the most vulnerable people who are sadly homeless and out injecting on the streets. So in terms of the structure for the cross-departmental working, I think the structure's already there, and it's in the executive subgroup that was set up a number of years ago around mental wellbeing, resilience and suicide prevention. So that structure's there. I think it's how we build on that. I think the will is there, I genuinely do, but how do we build on the cross-departmental structure that we already have in place? And just to talk briefly then on the responsibility of individual departments, and health does have a responsibility, as Diane says, in terms of what it does with its own budget and how it prioritises things. And do I think that we're, in terms of the responsibility of the health department, do I think that people are getting the health service at the point of need, whether it's to do with addictions, whether it's to do with mental health crisis or mental illness? I don't think we're there yet, and I do think the Department of Health has much more that they can hopefully do in the time ahead. But then also when you look at maybe, you know, the Department of Education and what they're doing to address mental health. And I do welcome the recent announcement the Health Minister made around that reduction of mobile phone usage in classrooms. I think that will have an impact on kids' well-being, the less screen time and more direct interaction. That's going to be a good thing. So that's a positive step, I think, that Paul Gibbons made around the education. But then hopefully can he make further steps in terms of reintroducing the Happy Healthy Minds programme and looking at the counselling provision that we have across our schools, across our youth clubs, how you get into that early intervention at the earliest possible stage. The Department of Justice, again, then, what more can be done in terms of mental health and addictions in the prisons? How can they improve the wraparound care and the rehabilitation for people that are in the prison system? How can they tackle the circulation and the use of drugs in our prisons? And is there any plans to try and prevent the production and the selling of vapes that are filled with spice and that are currently circulating in the schools? Department for Communities, I was at a mental health conference about 2 years ago, and one of the speakers, when he was asked about what is the biggest cause of our mental health challenges here in the north, and he just nailed it when he says poverty, poverty, poverty. So in terms of the Communities Department, what more can they do to introduce the anti-poverty strategy to try and deal with the homelessness, the people who are out on the streets? And it has been flagged up that there might actually be possible cuts to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. They're out of our service, which is dealing with those people that are sleeping on the streets, that are injecting drugs, the most vulnerable. When you talk about poor mental health, that is it. So I think we need to be really conscious of all that, and hopefully this is what the subgroup, the executive group, can be talking about and taking on head first. And then just to finish, Diane also mentioned the work of the new script mental health activists, and their approach is around the fundamental shift in how we are dealing with mental health, and I think that's the place that we all need to try and get to.
Okay, thank you. I call Donny Donnelly.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. I thank the SLP members for bringing forward this motion to the Assembly today. And as one of my party spokespersons on health, I welcome the focus on health and especially mental health in these Opposition Day motions. We have a mental health crisis in Northern Ireland, as recently has been pointed out. It is extremely concerning that the number of people who have lost to suicide is now higher than those who have lost their lives in the Troubles. Tackling poor mental health and suicide prevention must be a priority for both the Minister for Health and the Executive as a whole. It's welcome that the draft programme for government references mental health in reference to other departments, and to give an example from the programme for government, the importance of sport to both physical and mental health in the development of local sports facilities, which is a responsibility for the Minister of Communities. We need to address the causes of poor mental health and its overlap with both deprivation and the legacy of the Troubles. In 2023, 1 in 5 adults in Northern Ireland was prescribed an antidepressant. The highest uptake was 27% in the poorest areas of Northern Ireland, largely the same areas most heavily impacted by the conflict. This represents a 4-fold rise in the prescribing of antidepressants in the last 20 years. There's also been a rise in provisional figures for deaths by suicide, as mentioned there by Orlea, from 203 in 2022 to 221 in 2023. And as mentioned, these are people's lives and families that we should be aware of. The percentage of suicides in 2022 was 3 times higher from Northern Ireland's most deprived areas than the least deprived areas. We need a more urgent response from the Department of Health to address this crisis. The mental health strategy was a welcome step towards reform and transformation of our mental health services, and we need to see its full implementation. Some progress has been made on its 35 actions, but not enough. We also need an update on the implementation of the Department's Protect Life 2 suicide prevention strategy, which was extended last year to the end of 2027. Restricting access to means is one of the most effective ways of reducing risk of suicide, and as part of the Protect Life 2 strategy, the Minister of Health must work, particularly with the Minister of Infrastructure, on a collaborative basis to identify and progress any urgent work to prevent further loss of life to suicide. Targets to address the prevalence of anxiety, depression and other mental health conditions must also be introduced by the Department of Health, along with actions that can be taken to address and reduce these conditions. These should address all relevant age groups, with particular consideration to children and young people and older people. We need to see clear evidence that these strategies and actions are having a positive impact on the delivery of services. Lack of data on mental health services remains a huge issue, as highlighted by a number of organisations, including the Office for Statistics Regulation, the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and most recently by this Assembly's Public Accounts Committee. We need to know that the decisions being made and being taken through these strategies represent the best value for money and are improving necessary mental health services. One issue that, overlong mental health waiting lists result in people who need support very, very quickly not getting it, and inevitably their condition gets a lot worse. We know that much of this mental health support comes from the community and voluntary sector. The mental health strategy contains an Action 17, to fully integrate the community and voluntary sector, and at the minute this is being commenced, but seeking agreement on the best way forward. And as we will hear no doubt later on, many of these community services also rely on funding, which we know is very, very constrained. One issue that many members will be aware of is postnatal depression and perinatal mental health. And I would commend Claire Sugden for this morning speaking so openly on this issue. Depressive symptoms are very common during and after pregnancy, and the recent MAMI study from Trinity College in Dublin was discussed at last week's North-South Interparliamentary Association meeting, which was the first since 2016, and I would congratulate the Speaker for his involvement in making this important meeting happen. The study showed that 9.3% of respondents experienced depressive symptoms before pregnancy, 12.2% during pregnancy, 17.7% 3 months after the birth of their first child, and 12.8% a year postpartum. and yet many women were not asked about feeling depressed or low by their GP or midwife or public health nurse. There is clearly that needs to be done to support women suffering from mental health conditions related to childbirth, and while we recognise the progress of delivering perinatal mental health services across all 5 trusts in Northern Ireland, we will continue to push for the delivery of an inpatient mother and baby unit in Northern Ireland. As the chair of the All-Party Group on Addiction and Dual Diagnosis, I'm hugely concerned about the levels of addiction and death due to overdose for drugs in our communities, as was mentioned there by earlier. We do need to progress to a harm reduction model, and we need to progress an overdose prevention centre in Northern Ireland to help save lives among those people who are using drugs. In short, we know we are in a crisis and we need to focus on solutions. Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Danny. And I call Robbie Butler, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise today on this very important motion and the amendment that calls on us to face the stark and distressing reality of mental health service provision and how people across Northern Ireland are suffering. And as has already been outlined, we regretfully find ourselves in a situation where more people have tragically lost their lives to suicide than during the Troubles. However, it would be absolutely remiss of us not to understand that the nature of our troubles is being played out in intergenerational trauma, which obviously has an impact on the high prevalence of suicides and mental health and addictions in this country. And I'd ask the mover of the original motion just to reflect on what I'm going to say here. I understand fully why he is reluctant and his party is reluctant to accept the amendment. However, when I read the next paragraph, I'd ask you to reflect on it and take me at my word on this, because having this gentleman here as the Minister for Health in the executive is better than a rubber stamp on any programme for government in this sense, and I hope you'll listen in at this stage. So, as we reflect on the magnitude of this crisis, we must also acknowledge the tireless efforts that have been made over this past number of years to address mental health. And I am going to give the man sitting to my left the credit for that, because in 2015, Mike Nesbitt, as the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, commissioned the first standalone policy paper on mental health by any political party in Northern Ireland. This was indeed a groundbreaking moment, I do believe, one that sparked conversations in this chamber, which I, with pride, will always be grateful that I was able to do so, because in 2016, he then appointed me as the dedicated mental health spokesperson, the first for any party. Again, I'm not sure if it's in the UK, but certainly on this island. And that demonstrated our commitment, and this gentleman, the health ministers and the Ulster Unionist Party leaders' commitment to tackling this. However, we do need to be clear, whilst progress has been made, it has been painstakingly slow. Only through sheer determination and doggedness did the Ulster Unionist Party manage to achieve an agreement in 2019 and 2020 on a 10-year mental health strategy as part of the New Decade, New Approach deal. We also secured the appointment of an independent mental health champion, critical steps forward, but not enough, and they were in the face of objections to achieving those things previously. But today I stand before you not to celebrate these milestones, but to remind us of the work that still needs to be done. The motion calls on the Minister for Health to work with executive colleagues to make prevention of suicide a priority across all departments. And this is obviously because responsibility of health services alone is not enough to fulfil the societal issues that actually require a whole governmental approach, where mental health is affected by education, housing, employment, social services, and indeed poverty, as has already been picked out, to name only a few. But if we do not recognise this interconnectedness, we're setting ourselves up to fail. We must also recognise the particular vulnerabilities of different groups in our society. Young people, those especially affected by adverse childhood experiences, trauma, poverty, bullying, particularly online, and unmet or undiagnosed mental health needs. The fact that they remain on long waiting lists for essential services hurts us all, and it's not just tragic. If left unattended, it's a dereliction of our duties. Women, as has been mentioned, particularly those in the perinatal phase, are those affected by violence or abuse or at greater risk of poor mental health and suicide. Let us not forget the stark reality also that men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide. These statistics are not just numbers. They represent lives cut short, families devastated, and communities left in mourning. But what underpins this failure to transform mental health services? Many will focus on funding, but however, and in some part, and I hope I'm not pointing figures here, but we have to face into the truth. In some part, the failure to transform comes from the lack of effective government and governance. So between 2017 and 19, and between 22 and 24, Northern Ireland suffered from political instability. where government collapsed. Those 5 years without a functioning executive have not just stifled progress, they've added to the burden on those suffering from poor mental health, and I will accept that that was perhaps without intent. However, it is an unmitigated fact that I will face anybody on. Health and suicide ideation should be something that we are talking about until we fix it. I spoke earlier of the need for the interconnectedness, and this is where it comes from. The Protect Life 2 strategy provides a blueprint for action, stating, and I quote, "Protect Life 2 sets ambitions which will only be achieved by working together across government departments and with stakeholders from all sectors of society. Effective prevention is a collective responsibility. It requires sustained, collaborative and coordinated response across government at all times, statutory and community services." How can we achieve this if there's no functioning government to take ownership of these challenges? And I would call on everyone to recognise that fact today, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Robbie. I call Gary Middleton.
Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the members for bringing forward this motion today. From the outset, I want to join with others in remembering all of those who have died as a result of suicide, thinking of their families and their friends, but also thinking of all of those who are currently suffering with mental health issues. May that be our family, our friends, our neighbours, or indeed people within this chamber. Mental health affects us all. That is why the mental health provision and access to help and support must be a priority, not only for the Minister and his department, but also for the entire executive and all of us within this Assembly. Our amendment today that was moved by my colleague Mrs Dodds speaks to the fact that we need to utilise every single resource that we have to prioritise resilience and coping mechanisms from an early age. Whilst the original motion is right to highlight the need for a cross-cutting approach to suicide and suicide-specific interventions, it is important that we look at the issue of poor mental health in the round. This means cross-departmental working to tackle some of the challenges that bring about mental illness, the socio-economic determinants, the deprivation, the online harms, the addiction, trauma. In turn, by tackling these issues, which are mentioned right throughout the draft programme for government, we can tackle the disparity between suicide rates in most and least deprived areas, but also go some way to addressing the poor mental health that face so many within our community. So one of the questions that I would ask the Minister is what work he is taking proactively via his own department to bring together the other departments to seek to lead the discussions on that front. Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, it is also very alarming, and it's also unacceptable, that there were over 1,026 children waiting more than 9 weeks for the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service at the end of March of this year. That was 52% of children that were waiting. We need to see a plan that will address those waiting times. Those children deserve that early intervention, and I do want to note that there have been positive programmes, not least through the Department for Education and the Education Authority. The REACH programme is one such programme for children. It's about building resilience and helping those children deal with some of the challenges that are not only of the past but of the 21st century. So we need to see more of that type of work. But of course, when we talk about support for those struggling with mental health disorders, I think it is important to recognise that it affects people of all ages. And I think that we can't progress in this discussion without mentioning the issue of access to GPs as well, because that is a fundamental issue which we must address. There has been positive work around the multidisciplinary teams, but we need to see our GP surgeries become hubs for people who present with issues such as mental health. I will indeed.
Thank you indeed for giving way. And on that point, my concern is for those people who are slipping through the net. Last year, I had a deal in person with 3 people who were suicidal. They either didn't know where to go, didn't or couldn't get the services where they needed to go, and fortunately enough, I was able to help them. But for every person that does get the help, there are other people who slip through the net, and unfortunately, the outcome isn't good. So will the member accept that access to services and for people knowing where to go to get help is crucially important.
Members, an extra minute.
Thank you, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for that intervention, and he's absolutely right. Access and knowing where to go is vitally important. That's why I feel that GP surgeries should be one part of that mechanism. It should be a hub to ensure that those people who present with very serious difficulties know that they have a place to turn to. But it's also important to note when we talk about people slipping through the net, that is where in many cases the charities and the voluntary sector is absolutely vital when it comes to ensuring that people have somewhere to go. Just on Friday, myself and Foyle MLA colleagues attended the opening of a fantastic new facility of a charity called HURT, Have Your Tomorrows, which was established in 2001. Started through tragedy, but what we're seeing now is many more lives saved through that particular charity. Another charity, which no doubt the Minister will have heard of, is the Men's Action Network. Unfortunately, after 30 years, they have had to close their doors, which means that the 750 men who avail of their services, not least for mental health, will now have nowhere to go. So for me and for calling on the Minister, I think that we need to see a prioritisation of these issues. There's terms bandied about such as invest to save. Sometimes I don't like that term because effectively what we're trying to do here is save lives. The cost of that to some family, we cannot put a value on it. So I wholeheartedly support the amendment obviously put forward by my colleagues, and I would just urge people to get behind this. But ultimately, whatever motions we pass here in this Assembly today, it is going to require action, and all of us has an onus to deliver on those commitments. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Gary. And I call Peter McReynolds.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to speak to this motion today, and I thank the opposition for tabling it. I don't think it's the most detailed motion I've ever seen or the most lengthy, and I don't mean that as a criticism, but I think it's probably one of the most important that we've seen tabled by the opposition to make sure that we in this chamber never forget the high rates of mental health issues many people in Northern Ireland are living with, and the need for this Assembly and our executive to take it seriously. Principal Deputy Speaker, I'm an East Belfast MLA, but I was born in North Belfast, which has tragically well-documented high rates of suicide and mental health issues. I thankfully haven't had a friend or family member take their life, but I remember at one point in my brother's 4th or 5th year in school, 4 students sadly taking their lives across one academic year, which had a profound impact on the school and the students themselves. The gym I go to is run by Rory Givern, again from North Belfast, and he launched the 33 Till Infinity campaign to raise money in honour of Michael Cullen, who sadly took his life in 2018. And I still remember when I was nudged in committee in Belfast City Council to be told that Michael had been found after the community in North Belfast had rallied to try to find him for over a week. And to echo Orlea's point that she made earlier about the families of victims of suicide, I was there for the vigil last year, and I would encourage members to attend if they do so again for a truly humbling and insightful experience. Asking the question, are you thinking about suicide, is a very sobering but important skill that can provide the right intervention at the right time, something that I learnt during a training session with the incredible East Belfast survivors of suicide back in 2014. And I didn't expect to use that training the very next day with a constituent who walked into our constituency office to discuss housing issues, but the conversation took a dark turn. And lastly, Principal Deputy Speaker, my work with the ADHD community is well documented now, and it won't surprise anyone to hear that those living with ADHD are 3 to 5 times more likely to take their own lives and to sadly be successful. This is a condition that is more common than we think in Northern Ireland. It's treatable. Medication is 95% effective, but it's been described to me by a GP recently as a pretend service that we offer here, with our waiting lists hitting 8 to 10 years for a diagnosis, or you can pay to go private if you're even lucky to get an appointment, as demand is surging, and it's unfortunately another example of how we are failing neurodiverse people, and we're failing people living with mental health issues. I don't outline these examples for dramatic effect, but because they are the realities facing people in Northern Ireland in recent years and the present day. Principal Deputy Speaker, we know the statistics, we know prevention and early intervention works, We know there should be a cohesive, comprehensive approach from GPs to hospitals, because many are falling through the cracks even after approaching the right people for support, and we know investing now will save money in the long term and, crucially, save lives. I want to end my contribution today with acknowledgement to the work of former Alliance Councillor David Armitage. He told me recently that if it wasn't for Claire Curran from East Belfast Survivors of Suicide, an intensely overworked charity doing life-saving work, his church and his friends, then he simply wouldn't be here. Principal Deputy Speaker, that's what government is for, and it shows the importance of having these institutions functioning as they should, all year round, 365 days a year, with ministers in post for key decisions to be made for everyone in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I call Michelle Guy.
Thank you, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the proposers of the motion for bringing it forward. I'm going to focus on mental health provision and support for our children and young people. And statistics tell a story here. The Youth Wellbeing NI survey indicates that 12.1% of 11 to 19-year-olds in Northern Ireland have thought about or attempted suicide. The CAMHS waiting list from March this year showed almost 2,000 young people are waiting for an assessment. These kinds of statistics for adolescents are a particular worry, given these are formative years. The World Health Organization states suicide is the 4th leading cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds, and that is a shocking figure. And they further note the consequences of failing to address adolescent mental health conditions extend to adulthood, impairing both physical and mental health and limiting opportunities to lead fulfilling lives as adults. But statistics do no justice to the individual stories of pain they represent, the complexity of the circumstances also that have caused the mental health condition to develop. I took time over the weekend to speak with Matthew Taylor, a young man living in Lisburn who has openly talked about his mental health struggles, which eventually resulted in inpatient care. He tells of an uneven experience. Matthew got help, and he is grateful for it, but in some early interactions he was simply not believed. He was told he was selfish, and that if he was serious, he would have tried to kill himself already. It is crucial that when people take the difficult step to ask for help, especially when our resources are so constrained, that our pathways don't fail from within. There is excellent work being done to help young people suffering with mental health issues. Parents, guardians, healthcare professionals, teachers, community clubs and more are working to ensure the well-being of children. However, the need is just so great, more support is required. As Matthew's experience highlights, we have to ensure that services don't fail those in crisis. Staff interacting with anyone presenting in mental distress should have a basic level of training to ensure appropriate triage and referral. And as with so many things, evidence tells us early intervention is essential. Cross-departmental working and multi-year budgets are a must, and we need to not just keep producing strategies but implement actions. The Public Accounts Committee produced a stark report on our mental health services and where the mental health strategy currently stands. The disappointing progress it notes on implementation to date is in large part down to the fact that only 10 million of the 35 million deemed necessary for 23-24 was allocated. Perhaps it's time we stop saying we can't afford to do these things and accept we can't afford to not do these things. But the words that really jump out of the page in the PAC report is that it notes the majority of the work which has been done to date would not be felt by users. The actions we take must be felt by those who are suffering, and the Mental Health Champion identified clear ways for impact to be felt. The number one priority being the workforce and the need to grow the CAMHS and therapies workforces, yet little appears to have been done directly on this. While some good progress has been made through education and health, working in partnerships such as the Emotional Health and Wellbeing Framework, we still haven't had the funding for happy, healthy minds restored. Its absence can create unacceptable inequities within families. For example, children in the same family experiencing bereavement can have a Year 8 child receive counselling through school, but their sibling in primary school receives no support. More fundamentally, the independent review of education noted clear examples where the system itself creates unnecessary stress and anxiety, which can lead to or exacerbate mental health issues. Specifically, I'm referring to our SEND crisis and our current approach to assessment. I look forward to the Education Minister bringing forward an extensive departmental response to this review. To close, on page 44 of our mental health strategy is the line: children and young people should receive the care and treatment they need when they need it without barriers or limitations. Those can't just be words on a page in a strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I call Timothy Caston.
This is a motion that certainly every member in this House will be able to relate to and cite examples of how the current system is failing our constituents, who often then turn to our offices for assistance and for signposting. Prior to coming to this House, I spent 4 years in Jim Allister's constituency office, where on a regular basis I encountered people spanning all age groups who were struggling with their mental health for a variety of reasons. I can recall a mother whose primary school child was self-harming with a pencil in the school toilet. I recall an elderly man through failing health simply lost his purpose and the will to live. I think of the young lad who had fallen into an addiction and the father who, through redundancy, struggled to provide for his family. This is the reality of Northern Ireland in 2024. The common problem I've found when dealing with broken people is the lack of statutory funded organisations with enough resources to meet the needs of these people. Over the last 15 years, Ballymena has had its fair share of heartache, and this is where I want to spend a brief time talking about a local charity which has become a lifeline to many locally. In May 2025, Turning Point NI will be 10 years old. This charity was formed by local people as a reaction to the many young lives being lost through suicide in the area. Throughout the last 10 years, this charity has depended on lottery funding as well as the generosity from local communities to sustain itself. Turning Point currently have 9 staff employed, with their lottery funding due to finish at the end of March 2025. To put that in context of the local demand that currently exists, as of this morning, they have 90 people on their waiting list to commence a 68-week programme. Many of these referrals have come from statutory bodies such as CAMS. In financial terms, last year Turning Point estimated through statutory referrals alone they saved the Trust 70,000 through the council and sessions that they provided. This, members, came without any help or funding from the Trust. If we want to address the elephant in the room when it comes to mental health provision and suicidal rates, then look no further than this stark reality. Too much pressure is being put on the community and the voluntary sector to pick up the crisis the NHS is in. I asked the charity what key message would they like shared with MLAs today, and this is the response I got. Turning Point NI, urgent call for support. For the last 10 years, Turning Point NI has been a vital resource for our community, providing essential support for individuals facing mental health challenges. As we approach the end of our lottery funding in March 2025, we find ourselves in a critical situation. We are currently experiencing a mental health epidemic characterised by increasing rates of suicide, substance abuse and self-harm among young people. Our waiting lists for life-saving services continue to grow, and despite the pressing demand, our resources are severely limited. Regrettably, we have not received any government support to address these urgent needs. Therefore, we are reaching out for assistance to ensure that our dedicated team can continue their crucial work in supporting individuals in our community who are experiencing suicidal intentions and mental health crises. My goodness, how did we allow our mental health service and our health service in general to get to this point? Moving on from that, and as we move forward to make the case to Treasury for additional funding, we need to do so in the context clearly demonstrating why we have an additional need. Our failing mental health services and high suicide rates are one of the many reasons why we need to firstly be funded to the need at a level of £124 per head for every £100 spent in England. Once we get funded to that level of need, then we must once again look to the Welsh model designed by Hotham, where not only have we been funded to the level of need since 2012, but the Welsh model have secured an additional 5% uplift in 2018, which has been worth an additional £1.17 billion over the additional need. This is a huge amount of additional money. We must secure the equivalent figure for Northern Ireland and use it to address our unique local need, including the legacy of the Troubles as it relates to mental health and suicide. Unless we get serious and start to fund these services adequately, then sadly we will be talking about motions such as this in the many mandates to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. I call Jerry Carroll.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I think it's important that the Assembly and the Executive gets to grip with the mental health epidemic faced by all our communities, but obviously and always more acutely and sharply felt by working class and deprived communities, as has been alluded to. The rich, Deputy Speaker, can avoid the daily grind and go on relaxation retreats when they want to, but everyone else has to focus on paying skyrocketing rents, unaffordable childcare, historically low wages, and of course, not to mention with dealing with depression, anxiety and suicides, as we heard, tragically 3 times more higher in deprived and less deprived areas. Deputy Speaker, I know that mental health workers, counsellors and people in this sector are doing really, really important and in many cases life-saving work, literally, but they're trying to effectively push a boulder up a mountain. The system is completely broken, completely underfunded, and I think that's not reflected in the budget allocations and needs to be urgently addressed. We also have to ask, and I'm glad the Minister is obviously here, ask whether the Protect Life 2 strategy is first of all ambitious enough and more to the point whether it has worked, and given the tragic suicide figures, I would suggest that it hasn't, and I've submitted some Assembly questions to tease out some information about that, and we need to publish the review, which should come ASAP. We had a rapid review which was agreed in December of last year, but like most things in this place, is moving at a snail's pace and needs to be published ASAP. So there are massive questions, Deputy Speaker, about what the Department are doing about mental health and preventative measures. We also have to add that other decisions made by the Health Department, Health Minister and others on the Executive excuse me, will actually increase anxiety and mental health and possibly worse. I mean, the Health Department's decision, the Minister's decision to ban puberty blockers is already leading to fear and anxiety shooting through the roof amongst our trans and non-binary community, a really marginalised and isolated community. There's questions about that policy, whether that's doing anything good, which it's not, for mental ill health. The Department for Community and the Executive's decision to cut the winter fuel payment for 250,000 pensioners is, I'm sure, doing wonders for their mental health. A welfare system, Deputy Speaker, that dehumanises and literally punishes people in a Dickensian manner leads to poverty and more poor mental health directly. So all these issues, Deputy Speaker, and more are connected, and we need to call out what the Executive haven't done, haven't committed to around mental health, but also these economic and political decisions made by them that have battered people and led to worse mental health. People, Deputy Speaker, are products of their environment. They're shaped by it, and that's no more true than we're talking about mental health. No silo mentality is always mentioned in Stormont, but that's no more true than talking about mental health than any other issue. Along with others, Deputy Speaker, I also recently met with the new script for mental health, who are doing a fantastic campaign. They're a family of campaigners and activists, and I urge the Minister and his officials, if they haven't already, to meet the group. And the main point from meeting them was that we are likely over-prescribing people with antidepressants, and no doubt there are many people who do need these prescriptions, but I'd pose the question, are we as a society accepting the mass prescribing of antidepressants because it's cheaper than providing counselling, talking therapies and other labour-intensive but life-saving services? I would guess yes. So I want to commend all those families who have been speaking out and also holding people together through mental ill health and suicide crises, and thank all the campaigning groups who have already been mentioned, but also others who haven't but do that important work. I also want to mention, Deputy Speaker, West Wellbeing Centre in my constituency, who do life-saving work and important work, including with members of my own family, but who, despite a motion being passed in Belfast City Council a few months ago, are still waiting on that tens of thousands of pounds coming through from the Council to provide extra counselling sessions and services. So I call those parties currently blocking that motion and that money on Belfast City Council to get the act together and let the money be released. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I wish to call the Minister for Health to respond to the debate. And Minister, you will have 15 minutes. Thank you, Mike.
Principal Deputy Speaker, thank you very much, and thank you to the mover of the motion and to the mover of the amendment. The mover of the motion, Mr McGrath, began by reminding us that we have lost more of our fellow citizens to suicide than we did during the course of what we so euphemistically call our troubles. I remember making that point a few years ago on a live debate on BBC Radio Ulster, and the host reacted as if he'd been given an electric shock. And we're talking about a very researched journalist. So I think the first point about that is there's a lot more we have to do in terms of raising awareness, and the extent to which this debate raises awareness about suicide and poor mental health, so much the better. Mr Carroll there, just towards the end, raised the question of is Protect Life 2 ambitious enough, and it took me back to a meeting which Olivia Flynn chaired of the All-Party Group up in Derry/Londonderry. I think it was the McGee campus of Ulster University, when Protect Life 2 had just been published, and we were debating this policy and the idea that the target was to reduce the number of suicides by 10%. And we thought, gosh, that's not very ambitious. To be fair to officials, it's internationally based. It's, I think, the World Health Organization. So it is a sort of practical, achievable target. But I think what we all agreed was that it wasn't a target to be celebrated if we achieved it. Because none of us wants to go to one of the families who continues to lose their loved one through suicide and say, haven't we done well by reducing the rate by 10%? Because for them, the loss is 100%. And so, you know, crudely, one suicide is one too many. And I believe, because the experts have told me this, every suicide is preventable right up to the moment when it takes place. And as is often said, suicide tends to be a permanent solution to what is often a very temporary problem or emotion or feeling or set of circumstances.
The Minister referenced what others euphemistically refer to as the Troubles and the electric shock, sort of shock that the BBC host had when he knew and understood that more people died by suicide. Since 1998, that actually died during the course of the Troubles. How many of those deaths could be attributable to the intergenerational trauma from the Troubles and the consequences, the hangover from the Troubles?
I thank the member for his intervention. I think I'm well on record many times as saying if you take a map of Northern Ireland and put on that the hotspots, the Troubles measured by shootings, bombings, murders, and then you superimpose a contemporaneous map of mental health issues, completed and attempted suicides, drug and alcohol abuse, etc., you've got a match. You know, somewhere like North Belfast, to pick one area. So yes, the member's point is well made. That Protect Life 2 strategy was launched on World Suicide Prevention Day, 10th of September, back in 2019, and it's now been extended to 2027. And at least £12 million is spent annually on suicide prevention in Northern Ireland. And the strategy is also supported by activities in the mental health strategy. And of course, when the strategy was first published, it envisaged much greater investment and executive-wide buy-in than has actually been the case. And I have to say, Principal Deputy Speaker, in terms of those who supported the budget, the irony klaxon has not been silent during the course of this debate. And I know Mrs Dodds referred to the mental health champion expressing her disappointment at the allocation. And I really welcome the fact that Professor Siobhan O'Neill made those comments and made them so explicitly and so publicly, because having a mental health champion was my idea, an independent assessor. And it proves that she is an independent assessor when she can make those remarks. And indeed, more recently, I appointed an independent autism reviewer. And members will recall her remarks last week. And that, again, I think shows that in Emma Cubitt we have an independent person at work, and I really welcome that. The strategy on suicide prevention has 10 objectives, which I hope will achieve better. The first has great significance to today's motion. It seeks to ensure a collaborative, coordinated, cross-departmental approach to suicide prevention. And the Leader of the Opposition and members will be aware of the Executive Working Group on Mental Health, Resilience and Suicide Prevention, something Mr Middleton wanted me to refer to. The group plays an important role in ensuring that all executive ministers are both informed of and involved in the governance of the Protect Life 2 strategy. The group was established in recognition of the fact that suicide is a societal issue. It can't be solved by the Department of Health alone. It requires efforts across all sections of society. It requires each of the executive departments to recognise and step up to the fact that they have critical roles to play. Now, it's widely acknowledged that there are many factors that can impact on suicide. For example, financial difficulties, poor employment, a lack of housing opportunities. And the Executive Group affords important opportunities for ministers to hear at first hand from stakeholders about the impact of suicide and of exactly what is needed to improve outcomes and to prevent suicide and self-harm. The group also provides a forum for ministers to hear of some of the great work being done in our communities, and I think working in the communities is the key to better outcomes. So I've agreed the group should be reformed, and we could usefully discuss having a wider remit to focus not just on mental well-being and suicide prevention, but also on the wider public health aspect. And some members have mentioned my commitment to tackling public health in terms of health inequalities. Well, I believe this broader focus will help address the wider social determinants that are linked with poor mental health and poor physical health. And on that basis, Principal Deputy Speaker, I affirm that I am a fan of Professor Michael Marmont, a man who talks about not just the causes of ill health, but the causes of the causes. So, for example, we know smoking causes cancer, but what causes people to smoke in the first place? That, I think, is how we unlock better outcomes for people. So the advantage of this wider group I'm talking about would be that the societal determinants of mental health are the same as those which determine physical health outcomes, including individuals' experiences in early years, in education, in housing, in employment opportunities, in the physical environment and exposure to pollutants, in access to a healthy diet. It's essential to address these social determinants to improve both the physical and the mental health outcomes of our population. It will also ensure greater synchronicity across strategies, given close linkages between mental health, physical health, substance use and suicide prevention. Now, while suicide prevention is not explicitly mentioned in the draft programme for government, I always welcome the opportunity to work with other departments in this area. There's already much excellent work being taken forward with other departments, and I would like to take this opportunity just to highlight some of this. So, for example, the Department for Communities have rolled out a mental health first aid pilot scheme across that department. DFC have also ensured suicide prevention training is mandatory for all frontline staff. They also have a 6-point plan for managing suicide and self-harm declarations which are received from claimants either in person, during a phone call, in writing or via electronic media. The Department for Justice supports suicide prevention efforts through the PSNI, a contribution to the multi-agency triage team. PSNI has also developed an online mental health lesson plan for police officers. This aims to increase awareness of mental health as a significant public health issue here in Northern Ireland and prepare officers to deal with the sometimes challenging incidents that they will encounter where no crime has been committed, but an individual is experiencing a mental health or emotional crisis. The PSNI already train all student officers in suicide prevention rather than just suicide awareness, but some members will be aware that the Chief Constable, John Boucher, has an intention to introduce a policy called Right Care, Right Person, and this in recognition of the fact police officers are not fully trained to deal with all mental health issues, and I look forward to working with the PSNI to determine the best way to roll out that right care, right person policy. I absolutely give way the member.
Minister, and you were just referencing there the issue around the training of suicide prevention as well, and I know that it's something I've met with your officials on. I plan to bring a private member's bill to the House on making putting a statutory obligation on every department to provide suicide prevention for all their front-facing public staff. So I know it's a conversation to be had in the time ahead, but so hopefully it's something that the Minister and all departments can possibly take on board.
Thank the member for the intervention. I am in favour of departments offering that suicide prevention training. I think to make it compulsory for every frontline member of staff is something that I pause at, given that that member of frontline staff may indeed have had experience within their family or their community circle. And I think the member, Principal Deputy Speaker, is sympathetic to that. And can I just pay tribute to the member, because chairing that all-party group on suicide awareness, your work in terms of understanding and promoting, I think, is absolutely exemplary, not just on this issue, but of cross-party and cross-community cooperation, and I do commend the member for that. I want to go back to Protect Life 2. It includes a number of programmes designed to prevent suicide. These include Towards Zero Suicide, the multi-agency triage team collaboration between HSC and the police, resilience building, counselling provision, the self-harm intervention programme, the Flourish Church's suicide prevention initiative, and Lifeline, to name but a few. We have undertaken extensive research and engagement to better shape the future of suicide prevention service delivery here, and a review of Protect Life 2 has just been completed, and it's now available on the departmental website. And that review has highlighted the need for a more focused, more measurable action plan. And to achieve that, work is well underway to revise the action plan in line with that report, and also to develop a new 3-year delivery plan. This will set out the detail around how we will deliver actions and the targets we wish to achieve. The action plan has highlighted a new strategic action area around a whole-of-government and society approach. And Principal Deputy Speaker, as I bring my remarks towards a close, I do want to talk about the need for a societal approach. Mrs Dodds asked me to comment on prescribing rates, and I do think they are shocking. And I think it is a sign, a symptom perhaps, of the fact that we, to some extent, over-medicalise how we approach mental ill health. And I know pills and tablets and medication have their place, but so do societal interventions. For example, a community psychiatric nurse sitting in somebody's kitchen, offering the human touch, saying to somebody, let's go on this journey together, I'll walk with you, I know how to get you to a better place, is very important. And I've also felt that for a long time, societal interventions, empowering communities to understand the members of that community, to spot when they're not as they should be, and to know how to intervene is important. And Olafin mentioned the Christmas tree here. Well, as a member of the Ards Suicide Awareness Group that I helped set up a few years ago, last Christmas we put a tree in Tesco's, in Castlebone, in Newtownardstown. And on the table there were a lot of blank cards. And I sat one afternoon and I watched a number of individuals and families who came in, lifted one of those cards, wrote a note, put it on the tree. Shockingly high number of people. But for them, I think the importance of that very simple gesture was exponential. It just was out of all kilter. And for me, it just reminds me of the scale of the problem and the fact that if we can tackle it as a community, then we have a chance. So in conclusion, it seems to me if we really want to make a difference, there are 3 things that we need to do. First of all, there's the awareness, and once again I thank the members for using this debate to raise awareness. Secondly, there's an agreement on how to cure the problem, or at least how to address the problem, how to take a bite out of it. And the third thing is, how do we devise a policy with an action plan, a fully funded and resourced action plan that gives meaning to our determination to try and cure or tackle that problem. And if we can do all those 3 things, Principal Deputy Speaker, I think we will achieve better outcomes. And if we achieve better outcomes, we will offer hope, and hope for me is success.
Thank you, Minister. I call on Alan Robinson to wind on the amendment. And Alan, I just want to advise you, you've got 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. It is certainly with profound regret that we've had to debate the state of mental health provision in the province. Despite progress that we have made in some areas, the state of mental health care remains deeply troubling. The stark truth is the number of lives lost to suicide in Northern Ireland exceeds those who lost their lives during the Troubles, and the trajectory tells us that those figures may indeed get worse. As figures from December 2023 tell us that 17,500 people are waiting on a first appointment. And I have no doubt that we would be staring at even more stark figures had it not been for the 10 million that was secured by my party via the Confidence and Supply Agreement that allowed additional investment in the mental health services over a 5-year period. As has been stated on the floor many times, without timely intervention, people's conditions will descend in the further decline, and ultimately the condition becomes more costly to treat, or they're lost to suicide. The Department tells us without additional funding and without the ability to invest in its workforce, then they will struggle to address waiting lists. And on top of this, we have the Secretary of State tell us that we must live within our means. So for someone on that long waiting list, if all of us were to be honest, it very sadly, as things stand, is a case of no extra money and little hope. Emergency departments will continue to be the fallback position for so many in desperate need, placing further strain on already struggling health service and adding further pressure on our education and justice systems. And then we have the situation where those in outer fringes, such as the C&V sector, who have picked up the slack in providing support for those with mental health issues, have had their funding slashed. It's like a never-ending circle of despair. And I do fear we'll be having these conversations and another similar motion before the end of this mandate. And those who will come after us will be debating these issues in a new mandate, just like those before us debated these issues. Turning to some of the points that have been made, Gary Middleton talked about using everything in our power to deal with this and how 1,026 children are on a mental health waiting list. He also called on greater access to GP services. The proposer of the motion rightfully paid tribute to groups who are at the cold face of the mental health crisis. And he rightly said, one life lost is too many. Diane Dodd spoke eloquently, as she usually does, when she referred to only 9 million being allocated to the mental health strategy. She also referred to the impact the Troubles have had. Orla Friend highlighted how drug and alcohol deaths have doubled. Danny Donnelly talked about the importance of sport when dealing with health. Robbie Butler referred to the impacts of our violent past and how men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide. Peter McReynolds said that the motion was one of the most important in this chamber. And Michelle Guy talked about a young constituent, Matthew Taylor. She also referred to a recent PAC report and its findings and its recommendations. And Timothy Gaston talked about how he has met people of all ages affected and praised the work of Turning Point. Jerry Carroll said for groups, it is like pushing a boulder up a mountain. And they quite rightly talked about the cut to the winter fuel allowance, which will affect people's mental health too. I'll just briefly end, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker. We know the devastating impacts of mental health disorders, anxiety, depression and other mental illnesses are affecting people of all ages across Northern. And the burden of these conditions does not discriminate. It affects children, young adults, parents, grandparents, and affects us all. Every one of us in this chamber can point to a family member who has suffered or who is suffering. And yet, despite the scale of the problem, our mental health services are just simply woefully inadequate to meet the growing demands. But I do hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we can support our amendment today. It's broad in nature, we get that, but the meaning is there. And I thank everyone who today has contributed to this debate. It's been a very worthy debate and it's been set in the right tone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. So, as question time begins at 2 o'clock, I suggest that the Assembly takes its ease until then. This debate will continue after question time, when our next speaker, our next member to speak, will be Mark Durgan to wind on the debate, so the Assembly should take its ease.